Construction began in secret just weeks after Russia's withdrawal from Kyiv. Workers parked their cars a kilometer away and moved through unmarked paths to the work site, with labor taking place only when Russian spy satellites weren't overhead. Once they dug up 10 meters under the remains of the former Ukrainian fortification, destroyed by a Russian missile strike early in the war, they could work more freely. The spoils from all their digging had to be cleverly disguised and removed, all without alerting the ever-present overhead Russian spy satellites. Above ground, the former Ukrainian base on the border with Russia is a ruin, but an expansive control center hums with life below ground. State-of-the-art computers and spying equipment fill the underground space, and wires run through the ceiling above and connect with camouflaged antennas hidden amongst the wreckage or the forest above. Ukrainian intelligence analysts pore over the reams of data being collected by the various pieces of equipment, feeding it directly to the Ukrainian intelligence apparatus. This is but one of over a dozen secret spy bases. The equipment is all American, and the funding to operate them is almost entirely provided by this central intelligence agency. While the West dithers and debates over every single bullet sent to Ukraine, America's clandestine intelligence agency has been on the front lines of the war against Russia, with American personnel at work directly within Ukraine and beyond. Without their American allies, Ukraine would have fallen in the opening days of the war. The CIA tracked the movement of Russian troops in real time, relaying that information to Ukraine, who used it to launch deadly ambushes on unwary troop convoys and reinforced various angles of attack. CIA assets within Russia and Ukraine both sniffed out Russian electronic signals and broke their encrypted communications. When they bothered to encrypt them in the first place, relaying to Ukraine every decision made by Russian commanders. They were even aware of the precise moment that targeting data was fed to Russian cruise missiles. But this critical intelligence partnership between the US and Ukraine almost wasn't, and it took a lot of trust and courage both to develop years ago. Without the CIA, there would have been no way for us to resist the Russians or to beat them, said Ivan Bakhanov, former head of Ukraine's domestic intelligence agency, the SBU. However, getting to this level of trust took a lot of time and a buy gamble from the CIA. While the rest of the world was lost in the bliss of the Cold War peace dividend, the CIA never stopped assessing Russia as the primary threat to European peace and stability. Putin's concerns over Ukraine only grew over the years, as the former Soviet state spun ever further away from Russian influence and toward the West. He had ordered his intelligence services to interfere in Ukrainian politics for years, directly helping elect pro-Russian leaders who would keep the wayward nation under his sphere of influence. A cadre of former Soviets who remained in positions of power throughout the nation facilitated this. Russia and Ukraine are closer than brothers, so the saying went. But as the former Soviets died off or retired, new blood filled those positions of power, and the new Ukrainian generation wanted nothing to do with autocratic Russia. Pro-Kremlin politicians became increasingly unpopular, and as Putin's manipulation of Ukraine became ever more overt, the population began to lash out in an even greater and greater fashion for each pro-Kremlin leader that Putin helped put in power. The situation was becoming untenable. Putin blamed MI6 and the CIA for manipulating Ukrainians away from him, but Putin, who famously does not consume any global media by his own admission, had made a significant error of judgment. The Americans and the British, fully wrapped up in their own efforts to reset relations between the West and Russia, had treated Ukraine with silk gloves despite the Ukrainians begging for their assistance. The West wasn't courting Ukraine away from Russia. The Ukrainians themselves wanted nothing to do with their former masters. Something had to be done to keep Ukraine in line. February 24, 2014, exactly 8 years before Russia would fully invade Ukraine, Ukraine's pro-Kremlin president Viktor Yanukovych had just fled the country in the wake of massive protests that erupted after he rejected a bid to bring the nation closer to the EU, preferring instead the far less popular option of courting Russia. It was the straw that broke the camel's back, and the nation had risen against the corrupt regime. Yanukovych and his corrupt regime had fled the nation for the safety of Russia, and suddenly dozens of senior Ukrainian intelligence officials, all of them loyal to the Kremlin, had vacated their posts. At the headquarters of the nation's intelligence agency, the newly appointed spy chief, Valentin Nalyvaichenko, finds the remains of a smoldering bonfire. Thousands of documents have been dumped in the agency's courtyard and set on fire. Before fleeing to Russia, the corrupt intelligence agents that once directly sabotaged Ukrainian sovereignty from within have destroyed or stolen every sensitive piece of intelligence they could get their hands on. The agency's computers have all been either bricked or infected with Russian malware. The agency is eerily quiet. It's completely empty, and it'll have to be rebuilt from the ground up. But Nalyvaichenko knows he can't do it alone. At near midnight, he called the local CIA station chief and the local head of MI6 in Kyiv. Both agencies have only a small presence in the country, nothing more than an outpost, out of fear of angering the Russians and setting back the process of resetting relations. The men arrive shortly after, and the three men alone in the massive building, except for their security escorts, weighed the future of Ukraine's resistance against Russia. "I need your help. I can't do this without you," Nalyvaichenko states the obvious. The Russians here have fled, but they've sabotaged much on their way out and left behind many secret agents and outright traitors enticed by Russian money. The American and British station chiefs are suspicious. They've been burned by Ukraine before, and it wasn't the first time that Nalyvaichenko had made this offer. In the wake of the Soviet collapse, he had made this offer to the CIA before, but the nation's political swing back to Moscow tanked the effort. Nothing was agreed upon that fateful evening, but the seeds of America's most fruitful intelligence partnership were planted. 3 days later, they were watered and began growing. The incoming Ukrainian administration would not be friendly to the Kremlin. This was apparent to Russian President Vladimir Putin and all of his advisors. 3 decades of careful manipulation and intelligence efforts to swing Ukraine back into the fold were about to collapse in a heap of ash. That was a significant threat to Russian interests, and they knew that they had a short window to act. If they couldn't exert influence over Ukraine, then they needed to act fast to secure Russian interests in the region. Securing Russian access to the Mediterranean via naval bases in Crimea was the highest priority. The Ukrainian people were clamoring for EU membership, and even worse, there was a strong movement within the population of Ukraine to join NATO. Much like Poland and the Baltic states, NATO membership was seen as the only guarantor of Ukrainian security against Russia. Having NATO ships near Crimea would be an unmitigated disaster for Russia and something that had to be averted at all costs. Plus, the peninsula would make the perfect staging ground for an invasion into the heart of Ukraine if it came to it. From Crimea, Russian forces could pour across the south of Ukraine, overwhelming its still disorganized and poorly trained military. But that wasn't the only plan agreed to in the Kremlin that night. The separatist campaign in Ukraine's far east, in the regions bordering Russia itself, would now receive direct Russian military support. It would be that separatist movement that would be used as cover for the Russian operation to take Crimea. That same day, a plan long in incubation in case of a worst-case scenario was put into action. Russian special forces wearing uniforms with no insignia and in unmarked vehicles sped across Crimea to seize critically important sites. The violence was minimal. The confused Ukrainian defenders were unaware of what was actually going on. More than a few were traitors already, happy to welcome the Russian forces. In short order, these Russian special operators had taken the Crimean parliament and arrested any politician attempting to resist. A pro-Russian government was quickly installed, and accusations of Russian involvement were deflected by President Putin. According to him, the taking of Crimea had been the result of Crimea rebels and nothing more. Later, he would change his story, stating that Russian troops had simply acted on behalf of Ukrainian separatists to support them. Within weeks, an unmarked U.S. government plane is touching down at an airport on the outskirts of Kyiv, one of 2 airports that in 8 years would be targeted by Russian elite paratroopers in an attempt to decapitate Ukrainian leadership. Nalyvaichenko is waiting, along with a security escort and a personal retinue. Out of the aircraft emerges none other than John Brennan, director of the CIA. It's a good sign, thinks Nalyvaichenko. He's been begging his CIA contacts for assistance with fighting in the east, asking for satellite imagery and communications intercepts to help coordinate Ukraine's resistance against Russian aggression. The arrival of the CIA's most senior official is not just a sign that the incredibly wary spy agency is willing to broaden support, but that the Obama administration itself is willing to engage. Very good news indeed. But Nalyvaichenko's expectations have to be tempered. Brennan has come bearing the president's decision. The CIA is interested in pursuing a relationship with Ukraine, but only at its own pace. The agency remembers the scars of its past in Ukraine, and the CIA lost more than its wounded pride in the shift back toward Russia during the 90s. The new Ukrainian administration, led in the interim by Alexander Turchenov, had made its pro-Western intentions clear, though, and it's actively resisting the separatists in the east. Any fears of allegiance to Moscow were dispelled, when he ordered the Security Service of Ukraine to engage and destroy separatists who had taken control of various government buildings across the country. The agency, however, and the American president act in an overabundance of caution, much to Nalyvaichenko's frustration. First, the Ukrainians must prove that they can be of value to the agency, and second, they need to purge their security services of all Russian spies. The SBU is famously seen as an extension of the Russian Federal Security Service and is riddled with spies and traitors. As evidence of this, Russian propaganda promptly released photos of Brennan photoshopped in a clown wig and makeup. The Kremlin's message? They knew about Brennan's secret arrival and the agency's plans in the country. The two spy masters lay out a preliminary plan of action. The CIA will help sniff out Russian spies inside Ukraine. Their own penetration of Russian agencies is extensive, and Russian corruption makes it easy to sway Russian agents and politicians with large gifts of cash. They'll also provide satellite imagery and intelligence on separatist movements and plans. However, much to Nalyvaichenko's dismay, they refuse to provide any intelligence outside of this that could lead to direct military action. No targeting data, and nothing Ukraine could exploit directly for kinetic action. Back in Washington, Brennan briefs President Obama on his trips. The administration is deeply concerned about the new Ukrainian government's stability, especially with an emergency election coming up in the summer. President Obama also believes that antagonizing the Russians might prompt them into a full-scale military invasion of the country, and despite dwindling hopes in the face of a Crimean invasion, he sees value in a possible reset of Western-Russian relations. A failure to reset relations with the Kremlin would threaten his pivot to the Pacific, as America is forced to meet the rising threat posed by China in the South China Sea and beyond. China's military and economic might is such that America's longtime doctrine of being able to fight and win two simultaneous high-intensity wars is simply unattainable. The last thing the nation needs is to simultaneously face two powerful threats in different corners of the world. To make matters worse, intelligence reports indicate that Europe, still resting comfortably in the wake of the Cold War peace dividend, is ill-prepared for a war against Russia. The Germans, the most powerful economy in Europe, can't even meet NATO rapid response requirements without cannibalizing their military for equipment, and there are no plans on the horizon to change that situation. Europe has happily forgotten the war, foolishly believing that they could contain the Kremlin by courting it with deepening economic ties. Instead, they've handed Putin all the economic rope he needs to hang European economies, and he's now leveraging that rope to dissuade European support for Ukraine in the wake of his invasion of Crimea. The sanctions levied against Russia are light slaps on the wrist. Angela Merkel still foolishly believes that she can control Putin via their bilateral trade. President Obama warns her that she's made Germany hostage to Russian energy. She ignores him, as German media mocks the Americans for their Cold War mentality. Obama's hope to focus major military power on the Pacific to contain the Chinese threat is partially undermined by Europe's unwillingness to face the Russian problem. The last thing he needs is to antagonize Putin further by providing lethal assistance to Ukraine's resistance. The Ukrainians are disappointed, and many in the CIA are angry. The administration's decree that no U.S. intelligence agency can provide any support that could, quote, reasonably be expected to have lethal consequences are seen as handcuffs. The West's failure to confront Putin in Crimea has set the stage for the disastrous full-scale invasion of Ukraine to come. In Ukraine, Nalyvaichenko is frustrated by the lack of cooperation from the U.S. or Britain in gathering intelligence that can be used to strike at separatist bases and supply lines. Other than taking Crimea, Russia has not fully entered the war, but after separatist forces faced a series of disastrous defeats, conventional Russian forces, once more without unit insignia, had rushed to bolster the separatist lines. Now Ukrainian fighters are at a stalemate, facing off against better-equipped Russian forces bolstering the separatists. Despite this, the West refuses to step up its covert efforts. The mole hunt is bearing fruit, and many Russian-linked intelligence officers are fired. Some with particularly deep ties to Russia, who helped undermine Ukraine's defense, die in mysterious accidents. But Nalyvaichenko can't fully trust his own intelligence assets, not yet. So he forms a brand new unit specifically to undertake covert missions behind enemy lines. This new unit will consist entirely of a new generation of operatives, all born after the fall of the Soviet Union, and with no ties to the former communist regime. Known as the Fifth Directorate, its members have only ever known Ukrainian independence and are fiercely determined to keep their nation free. Amongst these elite operators is a young Ukrainian officer, Kirilo Budanov. In 8 short years, he'll become the chief of the Ukrainian intelligence services and wage an extremely successful war of sabotage and assassinations within both Ukraine and Russia, prompting the Russians to attempt to murder his wife in retaliation. The 5th Directorate infiltrates separatist areas and embeds itself amongst separatist forces. It also discovers loyalist movements that'll be exploited in the years to come to carry out sabotage operations behind the front lines. The young unit is impressing its CIA counterparts and building faith in its capabilities, but it's a slow process that Ukraine is determined to speed along. Without the CIA's help, Ukraine can't win this war. On July 17, 2014, a Boeing 777 operated by Malaysia Airlines flew its regular route from Amsterdam to Kuala Lumpur. The flight path it took over eastern Ukraine, with commercial traffic not yet affected by the fighting. Somewhere down below, a Russian Buk air defense system comes alive and fires 2 missiles at the commercial airliner. The tragedy will result in the death of all 283 passengers and 15 crew members. The incident sparks international outrage, and yet nobody can pin the blame on any one party. Ukraine claims it was Russian forces inside Ukraine who shot the airliner down. Both the separatists and Russia claim it was Ukraine. The situation is murky, and it's unclear who was truly responsible. An investigation led by the Dutch Safety Board and the Dutch-led International Joint Investigative Team is ramping up, but it has few real leads to work off. The 5th Directorate moves into action. Discovering the source of the attack and verifying it was indeed Russian forces would not be just of massive propaganda value, but would help galvanize the type of support Ukraine desperately needs from the West. Agents across the separatist territories work to gather information from human sources and record conversations via various telephone intercepts they've already established. Within a day of the crash, the 5th Directorate has forwarded along extremely compelling evidence that it was separatists and individuals from Russia's 53rd Anti-Aircraft Missile Brigade who were responsible for the attack on the civilian airliner. Given Russia's shoot-down of scores of its own aircraft in the future war, it should be of little surprise that their incompetence led to them targeting a civilian airliner. But at the time, the situation is unclear until the 5th Directorate shines light on those responsible. John Brennan back at the CIA is impressed with the quality of intelligence and the speed at which it was gathered. Speaking to the president, the CIA is finally cleared to begin meaningfully contributing to Ukraine's war effort. For President Obama, the downing of a civilian airliner is the final indicator that relations between the West and Russia cannot be normalized, yet he fears overtly hostile action provoking a full-scale war. The CIA is instead cleared to begin providing material support. If policy forbids them from directly gathering the type of intelligence the Ukrainians desperately need, then they set about providing the equipment and the training for Ukraine to gather it itself. Shipments of extremely sensitive equipment began to make their way into Ukraine disguised as civilian goods, and CIA agents began to arrive in force to begin training their Ukrainian counterparts in its use. Several 5th Directorate members and 2 other Ukrainian units are hand-picked to attend advanced CIA training back in the States. They'll be honed into an even more elite force known simply as Unit 2245. Among them is Kirilo Budanov, whose rising fame is making him a future star of Ukrainian intelligence, and the CIA has taken note. They begin building a close and personal relationship with him and other Ukrainian officials that will bear much fruit in the future full-scale invasion. Unfortunately, the relationship with Ukraine's domestic intelligence apparatus hits a roadblock in 2015. Ukraine's new president, Petro Poroshenko, replaces Nalyvaichenko as the head of Ukraine's domestic intelligence agency. In the personnel reshuffle, General Valery Kondratyuk is the head of the HUR, the nation's military intelligence agency. This initially causes the CIA effort to stumble, but turns out to be a blessing in disguise. Whereas Nalyvaichenko had been limited to domestic efforts while at the SBU, Kondratyuk and the HUR had the authority to act outside of Ukraine. The HUR, however, is seen in the West as a holdout for Russian sympathizers, and a new purge must take place. The United States hadn't bothered to cultivate ties with the HUR because of Russian sympathies and the agency's track record of producing no intelligence of value. Kondratyuk, like Nalyvaichenko, knows that the war effort will likely collapse without the CIA support. But to gain their support, he will have to do things like Nalyvaichenko and build trust from the ground up. Under Kondratyuk, trusted agents infiltrate Russia and begin to gather intelligence on the Russian defense apparatus. It's a dangerous diversion of badly needed resources, but it's a gamble that Kondratyuk believes is necessary. The intelligence won't produce anything of value to Ukraine's war efforts, but it might entice the West. Flying to Washington, Kondratyuk meets with the head of the Defense Intelligence Agency and presents a stack of secret Russian documents. The effort is impressive, but the HUR's reputation precedes it, and the senior DIA officials are extremely suspicious. Ultimately, they're reluctant to engage Kondratyuk and the HUR further directly. Kondratyuk is once more frustrated, but his agents continue to plumb the Russian military and defense establishment for valuable intel. They, like the CIA, take full advantage of the wanton culture of corruption that President Putin has indirectly encouraged. Still, unlike the CIA, the Ukrainian agents are far better positioned to deeply infiltrate the Russian establishment. Given their cultural and historical links, the effort is soon richly rewarded, and Kondratyuk meets with the CIA officials in the U.S. The Ukrainian general is taken to a Washington Capitals hockey match and sits in a luxury box awaiting the arrival of the newly assigned Kyiv CIA station chief. Kondratyuk removes several folders from a briefcase and lays them out before the CIA men. They are detailed plans on Russia's nuclear attack submarines, as well as other intelligence on the Russian Navy. It's a bona fide bonanza, and Kondratyuk promises there's far more where this came from. CIA analysts pore over the documents and confirm they are authentic. A week later, the new CIA station chief arrives in Kyiv to take up his post. His first meeting is with General Kondratyuk. The general's office features a large aquarium full of yellow and blue fish, all swimming around a replica of a sunken Russian submarine. Shortly after, in 2016, Kondratyuk flew to Washington for a series of meetings at an estate on the CIA campus, where the agency hosts foreign dignitaries. The two sides engage in an action plan meant to modernize the HUR, with the CIA providing training and equipment. The HUR, meanwhile, must purge its ranks of anyone with Russian sympathies. Operation Goldfish goes into full effect. The operation takes its name from a joke about two Estonians encountering a Russian-speaking goldfish who offers them wishes in exchange for its freedom. One of the Estonians crushes the goldfish with a rock, remarking that anything that speaks Russian cannot be trusted. New equipment flows into the cash-strapped HUR, and the CIA, satisfied with the agency's purges, begins training a new generation of Ukrainian operatives in its use. The gear is incredibly sophisticated and will facilitate tapping into Russian communications and all forms of secure data transfers. It can even intercept signals from Russian and Chinese satellites. In Western Europe, Ukrainian agents undergo CIA and MI6 training in adopting fake personals, stealing secrets, and evading spy hunters. Meanwhile, secret bases are being built all across the shared border with Russia. Later, when Russia launches a full-scale attack, most of these bases will remain undetected. Those that are destroyed are simply rebuilt underground, completely under the Russian noses. The CIA is running a full-scale boot camp for Ukrainian intelligence. While it's still forbidden from assisting with lethal intelligence, the effort to prepare Ukraine is running at full steam. In just 6 months, the CIA has partnered with Ukrainian intelligence, and the partnership is paying massive dividends. From its secret bases, Ukrainian intelligence agents snoop on Russian communications and run teams of agents gathering intelligence deep inside Russia itself. Soon, so much intelligence is being sent to the CIA station in Kyiv that it must be outsourced directly to Langley for processing. The Russians, meanwhile, appear suspicious but unaware of the true scope of the CIA-Ukrainian partnership, or how fruitful it's become. There's still a threat of imminent invasion, though, and the CIA focuses on building a network of Ukrainian sleeper agents. These men and women receive CIA training on weapons handling and everything from demolitions to secure communications and sabotage. They'll be reintroduced to Ukrainian society and placed all around the country, activated in case of Russian occupation. The plan shows incredible foresight on the CIA's behalf. 6 years later, these same agents will be responsible for significant Russian setbacks in their effort to invade Ukraine. Despite the growing relationship, though, the CIA was still barred by policy from helping the Ukrainians actually kill Russians. This significantly soured the Ukrainians, who were fighting for their lives in the east of the country. The occupied territories were seen as fair game for sharing live intelligence, including satellite imagery. This helped the Ukrainians to track and predict separatist movements and prevent unexpected ambushes. However, the Ukrainians needed more if they were going to win this war. They had to stop, or at least slow, the rate of supplies flowing into the east. To do this, they needed to strike inside Russia itself, When Kondratyuk requested satellite imagery from inside Russia, the request was promptly denied. His next request strained the relationship. He wanted assistance in carrying out a secret mission of sabotage inside Russia. HUR commandos would infiltrate Russia and carry out all of the kinetic work themselves, setting up explosives at key railway depots and junctions that the Russian military relied on. But they needed live intelligence from the CIA, as well as help infiltrating deep into Russia. The request was forwarded to Langley, where senior CIA officials immediately shot it down. CIA Director John Brennan personally called to General Kondratyuk to force him to cancel the sabotage operation. Striking inside Russia was, and remains to this day, a red line for the CIA. The move was blasted both within the CIA and Ukraine. The nation was at war, and one cannot win a war on the defensive. Some inside the CIA argued against the policy, but to no avail. The incoming Trump presidency was believed to have some Russian sympathies that threatened the existence of the Ukrainian assistance program entirely, and President Obama had refused to budge on his prohibition of providing lethal aid. Disappointed and angry, Kondratyuk opted not to inform his CIA partners of any kinetic missions inside Russia itself, moving forward. His first move was to send an elite team of commandos, the famous Unit 2245, into Crimea. The plan was that they would plant explosives at one of Russia's major airfields, to be detonated later in case of attack. The move would not just destroy Russian planes, but significantly slow an invasion. By depriving an offensive of expected air power, it would buy Ukraine badly needed time to organize a resistance to a sudden Russian thrust. This time, he didn't bother informing the CIA or asking for their support. Lieutenant Colonel Budanov was by now well known within Unit 2245 and by the CIA, with a litany of high-risk missions inside occupied territory under his belt. He had a strong relationship with his CIA counterparts that would prove instrumental in the years to come. After being wounded, the CIA even sent him to the Walter Reed Hospital in Maryland, where U.S. service members are treated for serious injuries. On the night of the Crimea operation, Budanov led a team of commandos in inflatable speedboats toward occupied Crimea. The men were dressed in stolen Russian uniforms and carried Russian weapons. They were also well versed in Russian military customs and would easily blend in with any airfield crew. The boats made landfall without incident and proceeded ashore, but then disaster struck. Somehow the Russians had been warned. There was an intelligence leak somewhere inside the HUR, and an elite unit of Russian special forces was waiting for the Ukrainians. A fierce firefight ensued between the two sides, with the Ukrainians managing to kill several Russian soldiers, including the son of a general. The Ukrainians suffered an unknown number of casualties, though that information remains classified even today. With their boats destroyed, they were forced to plunge into the freezing waters and swim miles back to friendly shores, an extraordinary feat of endurance for the elite soldiers. The operation was a complete disaster, and not just for Ukraine. President Vladimir Putin called the Ukrainians terrorists and vowed to strike back. The real question, though, was just how involved was the CIA in the incident, and could any of it be blamed on the US? The CIA had personally trained all of these men, and while the training had been meant to be defensive in nature, all involved knew that these were skills easily used for offensive operations. Vice President Biden attempted to assuage President Obama, who was furious at the Ukrainians and called Ukraine's president directly. The call would end up being leaked online, likely the work of Russian penetration of Ukraine, and Biden would famously state that the raid had caused a, quote, gigantic problem, and that it would be harder for him to argue in favor of Ukraine moving forward. Despite having been invaded, the United States was still handcuffing Ukraine's ability to fight back, a recurring theme in the full-scale war to come. Senior American officials called for the entire CIA operation to be shut down. The exposure was too risky, and there were concerns over provoking a more comprehensive Russian invasion. Championing the Ukrainian cause, however, was CIA Chief Brennan, who pointed at the heaps of intelligence from deep inside Russia that the Ukrainians were generating for the US. They had even captured numerous weapon systems and communications gear, including drones, that were quickly reverse-engineered in American labs, allowing the US to break Russian encryption. This key capability would soon come into play. In the end, President Obama declined to shut the program down, but instructed Brennan to reinforce what he called hard and fast red lines with his counterpart in Ukraine. Kondratyuk did not take the news well, stating, "This is our country, it's our war, and we've got to fight." Unfortunately, Kondratyuk would be fired over the operation and the blowback from the US. But the rate of Ukrainian operations did not slow down. Just one day after Kondratyuk was removed from command, an explosion in Russian-occupied Donetsk killed Russian separatist commander Arsen Pavlov. It didn't take long for the CIA to figure out that it was operatives of the 5th Directorate, trained by the CIA, who had conducted the hit. Once more, Washington was furious, and yet, with the presidential election only 3 weeks away, there wasn't much they could do. They would either be replaced by a Trump or a Clinton administration, and Ukraine ignored their protests, carrying out a wave of assassinations against separatist commanders and VIPs. In one particularly clever attack, Ukrainian agents set up a shoulder-fired rocket launcher inside a building deep behind enemy lines. The rocket launcher faced a window, past which was the office of the rebel commander, Mikhail Tostik. Using a remote trigger, the agents fired the rocket launcher as soon as Tostik entered his office, killing him instantly. Unit 2245 was on the warpath and free from their CIA fetters thanks to the pending presidential election in the US. But the Russians would strike back. Colonel Maxim Shapoval, commander of Unit 2245, was on his way to meet with CIA officers in Kyiv. Unbeknownst to him, a Russian agent had planted a remotely detonated bomb under his Mercedes-Benz. The vehicle exploded in a fiery blast that killed the colonel and wounded 2 bystanders. Miles away in Kostiantynivka, Donetsk Oblast, another car bomb exploded, this time killing Colonel Yuri Vozny, head of the counterintelligence department of the Security Service of Ukraine, and wounding 3 other security service officers. Hot on the heels of the attack, a massive cyber attack against Ukraine was launched. Russia was making its presence known and striking back at Ukraine's shadow warriors. The election of President Trump alarmed both the CIA and Ukraine. Trump had dismissed Putin's interference in the American election, despite a vast body of evidence to the contrary. Further, as the world leaders would later note, Trump was seen to fawn over Putin at global events. In the words of the Australian Prime Minister, Trump was like a 12-year-old child meeting their favorite football star in Putin's presence. The denial of Russian election interference and Trump's admiration of Putin led many in the CIA and Ukraine to fear the worst. However, Russian hawks within the administration helped steer Trump away from interfering with the ongoing CIA efforts in Ukraine. New CIA Director Mike Pompeo and National Security Advisor John Bolton worked to manage or distract Trump while visiting Kyiv to reinforce their support for Ukraine. They expanded CIA training efforts and funded the construction of more secret bases along the Russian border from which to spy on Russia. A key priority for both Ukraine and the US was to prevent Russia from interfering with American elections. For the Ukrainians, it was a matter of practicality. The unpredictable Trump could at any moment completely dismantle all US support for Ukraine, despite massive congressional pressure to not do that. A key breakthrough came in a joint CIA-HUR operation. A team of Ukrainian agents managed to con a Russian intelligence officer into giving up key data regarding the Fancy Bear hacking group. The data was forwarded to the CIA, who were able to use it to directly connect Russia's government to the infamous hacker group. This exposed the Kremlin as having directly interfered in the elections of multiple countries and blew the lid off their plausible deniability. The operation proved the strength of the CIA-Ukrainian partnership and would prompt a secret meeting at The Hague. Members of the CIA, MI6, the HUR, Dutch intelligence, and other unnamed international partners all met together to create a coalition with one goal in mind: wage a shadow war against Russia. In the build-up to the Russian invasion of Ukraine, in February of 2022, the CIA and its coalition of secret allies tracked the Russian buildup of forces along its border with Ukraine and inside Belarus. Yet nobody knew if this was merely a move to intimidate Kyiv and its young president, Zelensky, or a legitimate plan to invade the country. The CIA went to work uncovering detailed plans that Putin was, in fact, planning an invasion. The intelligence coup was impressive, given that few outside the highest levels of power in the Kremlin knew that an invasion was being planned. Not even the commanders of the troops being massed. The CIA and MI6 had uncovered not just the plan to invade, but exacting details of Russian plans, including the plan to either kill or arrest Zelensky and replace him with a pro-Russian figurehead. They even had lists of all the Ukrainians the Russians would kill or arrest and who they would replace them with. This list would later prove useful in rounding up Russian sympathizers in the wake of the invasion and preventing internal sabotage. President Biden made the unprecedented move of making the intelligence public, warning the world that Russia was planning to invade. Zelensky pushed back, blaming Biden for creating unneeded panic. He refused to listen, and inside Ukraine, the CIA and MI6 were already preparing to depart the country. However, a hand-picked team of CIA operatives were exempt from the evacuation order. They would remain behind and help Kyiv coordinate what was expected to be a counterinsurgency. On February 24, 2022, Russia launched its full-scale invasion of Ukraine, and the CIA handcuffs were officially removed. The spy agency was now free to do what it had prepared for nearly a century to do: defeat Russia on the battlefield. There were no more rules or restrictions on what it could or could not provide to its Ukrainian allies. CIA intelligence poured directly into Ukraine's War Planning Council and proved instrumental in setting up ambushes of Russian convoys moving against Kyiv to devastating effect. They were even able to provide intelligence to Ukraine that the Russians would open up humanitarian corridors for civilians to flee to Mariupol, but would shell the route the moment the civilians were using it. CIA intelligence also helped disrupt numerous Russian attempts to eliminate senior Ukrainian officials. Details remain classified, but it's known that one Spetsnaz unit with orders to kill Zelensky was discovered in Kyiv on the eve of the invasion and were all killed. Who provided that intelligence remains unknown, though the CIA did directly foil at least one attempt on Zelensky's life. Within weeks of Russia's assault, the CIA was back in Kyiv in force. By now, Ukraine held one of the largest concentrations of CIA operatives anywhere in the world, despite President Biden officially forbidding any U.S. military presence inside the country. CIA agents were spread across the country, verifying Ukrainian targeting data with information available to American sources to ensure accuracy, and helping plan military maneuvers. The CIA trained sleeper agents that had been planted across eastern Ukraine came to life, and a partisan movement was born overnight. In July, one of these groups spotted a Russian convoy preparing to cross a bridge on the Dnipro River and contacted their MI6 handlers. British and American intelligence verified the presence of the convoy using satellite imagery, and minutes later, Ukrainian rockets rained down on the convoy. The CIA and Ukrainian partnership remained strong, and while unverified, it's suspected that the HUR is now utilizing CIA intelligence and resources to carry out its ever-broadening campaign of sabotage inside Russia itself. Its attacks on Russian gas plants and fuel processing facilities, and lately a steel plant, are having a significant impact on the Russian economy and war effort, as well as reminding the Russian people that even far from the front, they are not out of reach of Ukraine's shadow warriors.